Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to USACM's virtual seminar on nanotechnology and lower-scale phenomena. I am Sushanto Ghosh, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Wei Cai of Mechanical Engineering Department of Stanford University. He has obtained his PhD from MIT, and his research focuses on predicting mechanical strength of materials through theory and simulations of defect microstructures across atomic, mesoscopic, and continuum scales. His work has been recognized by numerous awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award, NSF Career Award, AFOSR Young Investigator Award, Beer and Johnston Outstanding New Mechanics Educator Award, TJR Hughes Young Investigator Award, and Award of Scientific Achievement in the field of dislocation theory and plasticity. As a discussion of today's seminar, we have Professor Timothy Ruppert of Material Science and Engineering Department of Johns Hopkins University. With that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Wei Cai. The floor is yours.
Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, and thanks to the USACM Nano TTA to inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present our work. This work has been supported for a long time by the DOE-BS metals program. And so before I want to put it out here because in case I run out of time, I would just acknowledge the people who did this work with me. And many of them are my former students or postdocs, and the work has been going for many years. So many of these people have gone on to become, professors or researchers at other institutions, and we're now collaborators. And now Han Feng is my current PhD student working on this direction. And then we have had a very fruitful collaboration with Professor Katie Ramesh at Johns Hopkins. So let me sort of start by motivating or give a general background of the problem that we're trying to solve, which is basically trying to understand crystal plasticity in terms of dislocations. So for example, here, what's shown here are, let's say, single crystal stress strain curves of, let's say, copper. Those are a lot of those experiments done in the 70s because people really try to understand, what is how can we explain crystal plasticity. We know that it is carried by dislocations. So basically, the goal is to explain crystal plasticity in terms of the fundamental physics of dislocations. Now, just as a general introduction, basically, crystal plasticity happens by slip along crystal planes, but this kind of slip does not occur uniformly, across a plane, because that will require too much stress. What happens is that part of the plane will slip, and then the other part does not. And then at the boundary between the slipped and unslipped area, there are these defects, there are line defects that are called dislocations. And the dislocation will propagate, and then they will basically make the slip area more and more, and that's how you accumulate plastic strain. Now, that is a single dislocation, and that does not fully explain the crystal plasticity behavior. What happens is that the dislocation lines form these patterns at the multi-micron length scale, and that really, obstructs further motion of dislocations, and that gives rise to the strain hardening behavior that we are trying to explain. So why is crystal plasticity very difficult to explain? The short answer is that the dislocation physics span a very wide range of lengths and time scales. So it's a multi-scale problem. And here there's I'll take this opportunity to bring up an interesting analogy with the turbulence problem in fluid mechanics. There, the holy grail of fluid mechanics, I think, is to explain turbulence, and that it's a long-standing problem. So people are still trying to work on it. It's very, very challenging, and that is because in a turbulent problem, you have these vortices, and the vortices has physics across a wide range of, in fact, a continuous spectrum of length and time scale. So it's actually very analogous. Vortex is a line, actually, and basically something goes around the line, right? And here we have, in the solid mechanics, we have dislocations. The dislocations are line objects, and then at its core, it's controlled by the motion of dislocation. The mobility is controlled by the atoms, nonlinear interaction of atom at the core. So to capture that, you can do classical molecular dynamics, but sometimes people find that it's really very sensitive to the interatomic interaction. So you have to go to the quantum, like, first principles model. So then you can go down to very, very small scales, but at the same time, they form patterns at the micron scale. So to really explain, crystal plasticity, you have to, understand the physics at that scale. And then I wanted to say that in the multi-scale scheme of things, in fact, you can, there's still a lot of work to link all the scales and pass information. But I think that right now the weakest link is at this so-called mesoscale, and then how to go from this scale up to the continuum. Okay, at this scale is actually also present a unique opportunity because this is a scale that you can directly, try to compare with experiments, and then basically you can also couple with, classical MD simulations, which have become not quite robust now. And then from here, you can try to systematic coarse grain the discrete dynamics, and then you can get to the crystal plasticity sort of model. So I indicated here these three things, the connection between DD with experiment, classical MD, and also continuum. This is kind of a way that I organize my talk today. So we'll talk about these three different aspects. So here is the outline of my presentation. So we'll start with trying to compare the DDD simulation with experiments. Okay. Now this is just a very, very, very brief sort of overview of what the discrete dynamic simulation is. So we try to model the discrete dislocations. They form a network. How does that network evolve, right, during plasticity? The way we do it is that you discretize the network by segments. So the segments are described by the nodes, and then they carry on it the Burgers vectors, and then you do this computational loop. So at every cycle, you calculate the force. That's mostly based on elasticity. And then, given the force, you need to know how fast the dislocation moves. That is a material input called the mobility, and that is where you can basically couple to lower scale MD models. And then you integrate, but then you need to take care of the time integration. And then you need to take care of the topological changes in the network. So there are some tutorial or review paper we've written over the years explaining this algorithm. And now it gets pretty mature now, I would say. Now, about 10 years ago, we basically before that, we have always been suffering from the high computational cost of discrete dynamic simulations. So about 10 years ago, my former student, Ryan Seals, he looked into that and then developed better algorithm, time integration algorithm, to make us, so basically it's like separate out the different contributions to the dislocation velocity and then sort of handle different ones using different time steps, basically. It's a subcycling algorithm. And that really made things much faster. And then later on, Nicola Burton, who's now at Lawrence Livermore, ported that algorithm to the GPU, and that really made it much, much faster, and were able to take advantage of GPUs. So shown here is a typical simulation. It's actually a big simulation cell, but we cut it into 8 corners just so that we can see what's going on. Otherwise, it's just a big mess. It's blocking everybody. So if you do those kind of simulations with one GPU, about 2 weeks of computational time, you can get this kind of stress strain curves. You can see that this is like initially it's elastic, but then it yields. But after it yields, you can see that the stress keeps increasing. The flow stress keeps increasing in order to keep the plastic deformation going. So that is called the strain hardening phenomena. And then the slope of this curve is called the strain hardening rate. And you can see that we can kind of actually reliably, we can run the simulation repeatedly, get a pretty robust prediction of the hardening rate. So that was quite exciting. Because before that, we were like spending months of computation, we're still down here. So now we get a pretty robust prediction of strain hardening rate. So we can say, okay, can we then compare with experiments, and also can we also, on the other hand, try to explain what's the quantitatively what's the origin of the strain hardening behavior. On the right is shown those experiments done in the 70s, stress strain curve, right? So we're loading the thing. Actually, this is along the 001 orientation, so we should compare with this curve, the blue curve. And then we immediately have a problem if we try to compare them. The x-axis is on the order of a few percent, right? 1%. On the right-hand side is like hundreds of percent. Okay, so it's very difficult to compare. But in that paper, we managed to compare. I literally tried to extract some data from this curve, okay, by just really getting it from the publication. And what happens, I can only get 2 dots from this curve at this small scale, okay? But the good thing though is that at least if you look at this curve is pretty straight down here. So you can also just fit a straight line from there, and that is this straight line. So you can see that, actually the slope actually agrees quite well. So, but the flow stress itself do not, and that is probably because the strain rate we have is too high, and then you sort of have to pay a overhead to get the dislocation moving at a much faster speed. So if you make the assumption that maybe the high strain rate really just add an overall flow stress to everybody, then maybe there's a good reason why the strain hardening rate that we get here is actually quite consistent with the experimental strain hardening rate. So I say, in some sense, a qualitative comparison or semi-quantitative comparison, if you just compare the strain hardening rate, I think it was good, or that's what we can do at the time. So that begs the question, so we should have one-to-one comparison, okay? So now the reason that we have to go to high strain rate, that's kind of a computational, fundamental computational limit. When you go to microscopic scale, you typically also have to deal with much shorter time scales, and then you have to deform things at a very short time scale, then your strain rate is high, right? So in fact, this is not that bad compared with MD. If you do MD, then the strain rate is like 10 to the 7. So this is only 10 to the 3rd or 10 to the 2. But anyway, it will still be good to have one-to-one comparison, right, with experiments. Not usually the experiments are done in a quasi-static way, but strain rate at this, order is not that bad. It actually can be done. So this is where we collaborated with Professor Katie Ramesh at Johns Hopkins University. And he has this thing this is actually very small. This is, he called this a desktop Kolsky bar experiment. I mean, it's actually literally just this size, okay? So we did a collaboration during the pandemic, but later on I did visit his lab and saw that it was, wow, the whole thing is, because this picture, looks pretty big, but it's actually just like this, really on the desktop. Anyway, maybe we exaggerated how hard it is for us to go to low strain rate. So he went ahead and did the experiment at 10 to the fours per second. Even though we can handle 10 to the third or 10 to the two even. But 10 to the four is no problem. We can also, the higher strain rate, the easier for the simulation. So we try to have this comparison, one-to-one comparison between experiments and simulation, DD simulation at this high strain rate. Okay. Basically, it's an impact experiment. You have a rod that impacts it, and then the sample is here, and it's a single crystal copper at some specified orientation in compression. And also, the experiment will carry it out several times, because every time you do it, the strain rate is not exactly the same, depends on the pulse of the detonation. But the strain rate is recorded, so we input the recorded strain rate into the DD simulation. So those are the simulations at exactly the experimental strain rate profile. Usually what happens is the strain rate happens to be a little higher, then your stress goes a little higher too. Okay, so these are we did 5 samples of 001 orientation compression, and then 5 samples of 011 orientation. So these are the experiment and simulation. These are the experiments and simulation for the 10 samples on top of each other, right? So let's see, I always try to figure out which ones. I think the experiment is the smooth colored curve, and then the DD simulation is the because we repeat it multiple times, it's the more zigzag curve. And you can see that it has a fairly good agreement. So we were quite encouraged by that. But I guess before we sort of, sound the trumpet that, this is a fantastic success. Actually, we have to look at this work sort of more carefully. So it's like, what exactly have we done here? So basically, there are good news and bad news. Okay. The good news, okay, let me say the good news first, is that you can see that there are actually pretty good qualitative agreement in the shape of stress strain curves, okay? And not only that, you can even see that, in the 001 orientation, the stress strain curve is more rounded, and then the 011 is more corner. Even that is captured. So we're quite encouraged by that. But at the same time, this is not a fully just, first principles prediction, okay? The distributed dynamic simulation is not a first principles model. It has a lot of inputs, and the result depends on those inputs. And what I'm showing here in this work, these curves are the inputs that agrees with the experiments the best. If you change those inputs, the results will be different. So you can say that the parameters have been adjusted in the DD to match the experiments. But the fact that they actually can match, I think is encouraging. Now, what are the inputs? Those inputs are not just fitting parameters; they are physical inputs, right? So one of them is what's the initial dislocation density. We don't know exactly what's the initial dislocation density, but the number we put in is quite reasonable. It's a little bit on the high side, but it's reasonable for a sort of undeformed copper. Now, but the biggest problem is the mobility parameter, right? I mentioned that earlier. That's given under a certain stress, how fast the dislocation moves. And here we use a very simple linear mobility law. So we just say the velocity is this m times the stress. Okay. For copper, there is literature value. Okay, that literature value comes from both experiments and these simulations. That's on the order of 10 to the fourth. In fact, it's actually even bigger than that. It could be 5 times 10 to the fourth, okay? But we found that if we use that mobility law, it won't agree with the experiment. The stress strain curve we predicted will be much lower. So you have to use smaller mobility law parameter to agree with experiments. And furthermore, we have to have, for the 001 orientation, we have to use an even smaller mobility law than 011 orientation. So that is kind of the biggest problem in some sense, the biggest defect, if you want, or criticism you can raise for this work is like, okay, I mean, the mobility. But other than that, every other parameters that we use for the simulation, they are the same, okay? They are same simulation for parameter for all of them. Because if you adjust just individual parameter, then we can have perfect fit for every curve, right? So this is, other than this adjustment for the mobility, there's a unique parameter set for all the simulations, okay? So what happens? I mean, so how can the mobility actually depends on which orientation we load the sample? That doesn't make sense, okay? So in this paper, we offered a conjecture. It's something that I always worried about anyways, is that in crystal plasticity, in plastic deformation, the dislocation are moving around, and the dislocation, one slip plane will cut the other slip plane, dislocating other slip planes. And by nature of the dislocation, whenever it goes across, it produces a slip, right? So it will basically cut each other and will produce little steps on each other. And sometimes those steps are out of the slip plane of the original dislocation. So those are called jogs. And the jogs could slow down the dislocation. I mean, there have been, sort of considerations that, or early studies of how jogs might affect dislocation mobility. Now, that seemed to make sense because in 001 orientation, it's a highly symmetric loading orientation. So the dislocation on all planes are activated and they're all cutting each other. So you can imagine there will be more jogs. Whereas in 011 orientation, there are only two planes that are activated. So there are fewer jogs. So if the jogs are slowing down dislocation, then this could be an effective parameter that is trying to capture the physics that's missing, because in the DD simulation, we didn't consider, because it's very challenging to consider jog, their atomic size. So we didn't consider that, and most people doing DD simulation didn't consider the jogs. And then in order to agree with the experiment, I think the model is trying to compensate that by using a lower mobility. So that is what we hypothesized. So the paper was published with that conjecture. But then we said, okay, maybe we should test it. Okay, let's see whether that's the case. So these are some MD simulation we did to test that hypothesis. We start out with this MD simulation of edge dislocation. This one has no jogs. Okay, if you look from the side, the dislocation is exactly on its plane. Okay, so there's no jogs. And then now this is the other one in which you can see that the dislocation is over here, but then we introduce a pair of jogs. So the middle part goes down by one atomic plane, and then it goes up again to satisfy prior binding. So it has a pair of jogs. And then if you do this simulation, at 300K, under the same stress, you can see that the guy with the jog is moving slower. Okay, so the jog, and in fact, because of that, it's dragging the dislocation. The jog is dragging the dislocation. You can visibly see the dislocation is being pulled back by those jogs. Okay, and then if you repeat the simulation at different, in this case, it's like 300K by the different stresses. So you can see the mobility here, velocity as function of stress. On this plot, it may not look like a lot because eventually the velocity goes very high. At very high stress, the velocity are the same. Okay, but we have to remind ourselves that basically in this strain hardening deformation situation, we're at very small stress here. Okay, you look at the stress strain curve we're talking about here. So basically, we're very small stress. So we're like on the order of 100, or in experiments even less stress, right? Down here, you can see an enormous difference in the mobility or the velocity between a dislocation without jogs and dislocation with jogs. Okay, so I think that confirms that indeed jogs are happening, right? I mean, first of all, jogs are happening when you're in a multi-slip orientation, but then when they appear, they can severely lower the mobility of dislocations. Okay, and after we did that, we realized that actually there was a study earlier in year 2000 actually by David Rodney, and then we actually happen to use the same potential, and then they did the study at 100 Kelvin and basically reported very similar findings. But other than that work, basically people have been, in the sense of this, all the dislocation mobility study in this multi-scale hierarchy, most of the simulation never consider jogs, okay? And there's nothing wrong with that mobility, but it's just that now you see the comparison with experiment is teaching us that we have to consider jogs, because if not, then the mobility we're using are the mobility of straight dislocations, and that is the dislocation that's moving during the plastic deformation is not moving at that mobility. Okay. Now, since then, we did the more systematic study trying to come up with a mobility law that actually can be used, right, to consider the jogs in the discrete dynamic simulation. This is a schematic of kind of what is happening. So if you don't have jogs in FCC, you sort of move in this two regime. So first you have a linear mobility law, but then when you go really, really fast, it has to be limited by the sound velocity. So it goes from linear to relativistic regime. But if you have jogs, then you have a initial non-linear regime because the jogs, because of the jog, the motion becomes thermally activated. And then if you overcome the thermal activation by stress, then you go to the linear regime and then again, okay? And then this is what we find if you increase temperature, okay? Only increase the temperature. And this is a very surprising finding, is that we found that as you increase the temperature, all of these velocity stress curves seem to pass through an invariant point. And this was never reported before. So it's kind of very nice, is that if your stress is below the critical stress, you're in a thermally activated regime where you increase temperature, it will increase the velocity, okay? Above the critical point, it's in the phonon drag regime, increasing temperature will decrease the velocity. And right at the invariant point, it actually does not change. So this is a schematic. So I'll show you the data. The data looks like this, but if you zoom in, they all seem to nicely cross an invariant point. So that was published in here. I don't think we have a explanation of why there's an invariant point here. We could only just report it. Okay, but in any case, this set of simulation is then actually parameterized into a set of mobility law, then at least provide a starting point for dislocating dynamic simulations, including jogs. Okay. And also there's another thing I'll just mention very briefly. Also for dislocating with jogs, my students sort of just did the simulation a little longer and find another thing that's very intriguing. You got a edge dislocation with a pair of jogs, and there's no problem for the jog to just glide in the x direction. It's a purely conservative motion. There's no need to climb. In fact, if they climb, they will need to move along the dislocating line. There's no need to do that because we didn't apply stress to force it to climb. And in fact, if it does that, then you'll have to either emit vacancies or interstitials. There's no need for it to do that. We didn't apply stress for it to do that. But from the DD simulation, MD simulation, we find that the jog was moving along, but if you run the simulation longer, we find out sometimes this happens. The jog just spontaneously want to climb along the discrete line, and in a non-conservative motion emits vacancies. So that is very puzzling. We had a explanation of what is causing it, but it's still if you think about it, it's very strange. And that actually also unfortunately means that that actually initially what I thought is a much simpler problem where you can focus on FCC because then you just have dislocation, interact with each other to explain the stress strain curve, right? But now it seems like the dislocation, while they intersect with each other, so you will have jogs. That's unavoidable. But then the jogs will just spontaneously will want to climb and then emit vacancies. So then you can imagine all of these vacancies are there, and then the next return come in, they will interact with these vacancies, right? So it's a quite complicated scenario. So we cannot avoid the jogs. Now the jogs are saying that we may not be able to avoid the vacancies. So crystal plasticity may turn out to be more complicated than we thought. So so this is just a quick summary of the part that we discussed, and so basically we enable our first ever one-to-one comparison between DD simulation with experiments at the high strain rate, 10 to the fourth. And that work, lead us to wonder why the mobility law has to be much smaller than what people believed. And then that lead us to study the jogs by MD simulations, and we found that jogs indeed lower the mobility of dislocation. And then there's a surprising behavior, is like the jogs also emit vacancies. Okay. I guess the moral of the story is that, well, I guess it's important to compare simulation or theory with experiments, and through this comparison, usually don't agree perfectly the first time you try, and then there actually are good lessons nature is trying to teach us through those discrepancies. Now I think for the last part, I'll go a little faster to be on time and leave time for discussions. So we'll come back to the DD simulation and then say, okay, let's say it has a reasonable agreement with the experiment, so that it's maybe the DD model is a good enough platform, maybe for us to try to understand crystal plasticity. So have we learned anything from doing those DD simulations? So I guess what I'm going to present are the things that we learned by looking at those DD simulations, assuming that the model is reasonably acceptable, right? It's like, how do you go from that to continuum? So this is kind of the one way to go about this is like, you can say, ultimately, we want to be able to go to a continuum theory, which will, is what people can use in the constitutive model in finite element simulations. So we can look at, let's say, single crystal plasticity models, right? And in the past, it has been sort of just, you propose a certain form and then you try to fit it with experiments. But now we can try to, because we can do a large number of DD simulations, so we get actually a lot of data, like 10 terabytes of data, recording all the details of all the simulations, loading all different hundreds of orientations. So maybe from those data, we can systematically coarse grain and construct constitutive equations from there, both in terms of fitting the parameters and in terms of questioning whether the form is correct. Okay, we tried to do that initially several years ago. Tried to do that using a machine learning approach, but we didn't succeed. So the results, most of the results I'm showing you here are actually manual work. It's not machine learning, it's the students learning, okay, human trying to learn this, data mining. So this is one way to go about this. It's like in a crystal plasticity model, in FCC, we have 12 slip systems. So you basically say, okay, we want to know what is the shear rate on every slip system. So it's gamma dot I go from 1 to 12. And that usually depends on the flow stress on that, not the resolved shear stress on that system. And then also, let's say, some microstructural parameter, which let's call it dislocation density. And then Josephson density itself also evolves. That would depend on both the Josephson density on other slip systems and then the result shear stress. So this is you can say it's pretty complicated, but this is a set of ODEs, right? That has only 24 degree of freedom. So it's a great simplification from that, from the full, DD simulation. The question is, where does the function f, which is the flow rule, and the function g, the multiplication, coming from? But if we can learn that from the DD data, then then that's like a more systematic way of doing it, right? So I will go through some of the things very quickly. One thing is that my former student Hamed, so he looked at all this data, and then this is the best he can find. So he found so this is a pair relationship. The flow stress as function of gamma dot, and then if you invert it, then it's the gamma dot a function of applied stress. That I would say it's reasonably supported by the DD simulation, and then he compared different functional forms, and this is the best he can get. But of course, you can see that there's still a lot of scatter, and that is because this coarse grain model is a much more simplified model than the original one, right? So, so the next step would be, try to see whether we can develop more on top of this, more sophisticated model to explain away the remaining variance. The other thing is the multiplication rate, right? So because in order for this ODE to run, you need to know how the rho evolves. And then this is where we sort of try to compare with the DD data suggests that in addition to the classical Cox-Mekin model, you have to add a correction term to it. Because the Cox-Mekin model says that the Josephson multiplication rate is proportional to the shear rate. That means if there's no slip activity on a certain plane, there should not be any multiplication, which is quite reasonable thing to assume. But the DD data suggests that no, actually there are cases in which a slip system has no activity because there's no result shear stress on that, but it still multiplies, okay? And then that actually happens quite a lot, so we call it slip-free multiplication. And then in order to describe that, you have to add a correction term, right? So that is, if there's time, I can go into more detail about that. The DD data suggests that, and then we go back and then find what is the reason, the mechanism that's causing that. So the last thing I want to mention is, so this gets to a little bit more recent work, is that what about, so because all of these are very coarse-grained, models. What about the Josephson structure itself? So we know that Josephson form a network, and then this network, you can consider that as nodes connected by links, which are like arms, right, or edges. And the edges have length, right, physical length. So a while ago, my former student Ryan, and so we had this. We find out that from our first set of big simulations, that the length distribution appeared to be an exponential distribution because it's a straight line on a log, semi-log scale. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, but that was an aggregated plot of the whole thing, and that's okay if you do a highly symmetric orientation loading because it's pretty isotropic. So more recently, so what we did is that we try to extend the analysis to individual slip systems. So there are 12 slip systems, right? And then we look at it very carefully because this one expands 3 orders of magnitude, but we collect more statistics, so we kind of go by like 6 orders of magnitude. So the statistics here are very rare, but if we average over many configurations, we get those data. And we found out that at this large, there's a long tail that follows a different distribution. Okay, so with a very, characterize it using 2 exponentials. Okay, so how does this relate to our, what we want to do? We want to construct flow rule, right? So this is some sort of the work that were initially reported in Hamed's thesis, but we're still trying to pin it down. So the DD data can tell us not only what's the slip rate on every slip system, but also what is the contribution of that slip rate from links of different lengths, right? So this is gamma dot. It's the same gamma dot as as in here, but let's just partition them from links, contributions of links at different lengths. So the integral of that would be the gamma dot over there. And you see that it's very interesting that if you look at it, its peak is kind of coming from links of length that are 5 times the 5 times the average link length. But if the integral value, actually there's a lot of contribution from very, very long links. Okay, these are very rare links, but very, very long. Okay, so basically that sort of gets to this thing. It's like, even though these are very low statistics, I mean, in terms of number of links, they are in some sense the dominant contribution to plastic flow. And I think this is kind of consistent with the notion before that, usually people think about there's mobile dislocation and immobile dislocation, but how do you characterize which one is mobile, immobile? Here you seem to say that basically the so-called mobile dislocation are very, very long links. Okay, they have this particular distribution, and if you integrate all of them, they contribute more than 50%, right? Like probably more like 70% of the plastic strain rate. So we need to pay attention to those very long links. So let me wrap up. So I present a number of things, and in terms of what we go from here, I think the DD simulation is getting to a point that you can actually we can run. We still are limited to high strain rate, but the computer and the GPU are getting more and more powerful. We're already getting a lot of data, and then we can try to learn from those data, and then try to actually systematically construct constitutive laws, right, for continuum. And for that purpose, we actually have, so we have been using the Paradis code for 20 years, but we're getting more and more impatient with the Paradis code. It's kind of clunky. So since last year, my colleague, Nicola Burton and I, we decided, okay, we're going to rewrite it. So we wrote, mostly Nicola, wrote a open this, and we really want to make it, so it's on GitHub, and we want to make it a sort of open source project, and have, so we'll provide the core, and then people can build on top of that. So we sort of try to model ourselves after the success of LAMPS, for example. And I think the framework is quite promising. Basically, the front end is Python, okay, but then the back end is it's high performance computing. It could be CPU or GPU, and it's like you're using Python, but don't worry about the efficiency loss in Python. You can think about PyTorch. Right? Everybody do PyTorch, and nobody worries about, oh, hey, it's in Python, it's kind of slow, right? Because there's backend that is fully optimized. So we welcome everyone to take a look, and then we'll have a very nice documentation page, and maybe you can integrate that in your teaching, or try to learn a little bit more about discrete dynamics, and then actually maybe join the project and contribute some of the things that you wrote to the community. We already had our first online workshop last year, and then we're going to try to have our second one in person, and we try to do it maybe within the MMM conference later this year. So with that, I'll stop here and take any questions.
Excellent. All right, so I'll jump in and try to maybe organize the questions and ask people to sort of raise their hands when they have them. Maybe to kick us off, I tried to write down some notes on overall themes that I thought were really popping out. One of them was this importance of multiple scales, right? So Professor Tsai was jumping between different techniques and showing us how you could learn things along the way and get into some of the nuance, which I thought was a really interesting point, that we need these multiple scales to get there. I also really took note of this idea that we need to have interactions of simulations and experiments so that we can sort of learn things from where they don't match and start to get into the nuance and the details of things. Professor Dada, would you like to jump in with the first question?
Yeah, sorry, my voice. I work in the energy storage materials. So my question is, in energy material, we have intercalation and de-intercalation. So let's say you have silicon, lithium is going and lithium is coming. So in slide 25, you showed the flow model. So I want to know, is there any analogy that can be extended for energy material to develop a dislocation-dependent transport model? Because currently in energy material, we just compute the energy barrier and calculate the diffusivity. So did you see, is there any analogy with the energy material? For example, high strain rate, you replace with high charging rate, like this kind of analogy. Because I saw you have some paper in energy material.
Right. So I can maybe that is a question that sort of is related with this open disk project. I mean, of course, how do I say this? This work that's about crystal plasticity and all that, of course, only applies to crystalline materials, right? And hopefully it's not, it's like you got a big of, in fact, it's a crystalline domain. Now, so if we have problem in which, things in a crystal, in particular dislocation, plasticity is playing a role, but then you have other things that you may want to integrate with it. I think the open disk sort of provides a framework that may help you. We developed Paradis, but now we look at it, it's like very difficult to extend because the way we wrote the code. But the open disk more modular, so the idea would be that we provide a computational core that will take care of the dislocation part, but if you have other things, you can develop another module that can talk to this module. For example, we were thinking like, in my own research, it's not intercalation, but we are interested in hydrogen, okay? Hydrogen embrittlement. So the hydrogen will diffuse, right? So you can imagine, I mean, it's not in open disk yet, but you can imagine I can have another module that kind of handles the diffusion of hydrogen. And then the dislocation mobility could depend on hydrogen concentration, right? So it's just, I can honestly say that, sounds like the open disk framework could, in principle, be useful in those scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Odmal, you have a question in the chat. Would you like to ask any of those, or do you want me to read them?
That's okay. Let me ask. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for the great talk. So let me actually start with the most general, actually, with question 3. You clearly showed why jogs are important, and as far as modeling goes, is there a necessity for us to model jogs explicitly, include them into your DDD simulations? Or is it possible to just kind of model them indirectly as an effective mobility, depending on sort of the jog density or dislocation Cs? That's my first question. So maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let me take on that first. So I think the experiment has clearly showed us that we need to account for the effects of jogs, right? If we don't account for the effect of jogs, it's going to be very bad. Now, I don't think people want to include jogs explicitly, like by modeling like a little segment in the DD. That's just not possible. So in fact, in the DD, I would envision a discrete mobility that depends on how many jogs does it have on every segment, okay? But then how do you get that mobility from? Well, we try to do it, from MD simulation. I mean, in fact, here actually there are different configurations. These are all like dislocation with different number of jogs on them and all that. But you can imagine it's very tedious. So not sure whether either this can be done all by high throughput, okay? And then we just get something out of there, or maybe after you've done sufficient number of simulations, you sort of try to develop some kind of a rule, right? Because more jogs mean more resistance, right? So yeah, so I think I would believe that we'll first try to do enough MD simulation to sort of extract how would the jog affect the mobility, and then kind of try to put that effectively in the DD simulation. But this original thing, because we were caught off guard, right? But this is quite unsatisfactory, because like I don't know even where does this effective M could come from, other than this was fitted to the experiments.
Okay, so thank you. And this is a very quick question. You showed that surprising simulation where point defects were getting emitted in the jog dislocation, right? So does this happen in like a BCC material? Like, is this a stacking fault effect? Does it happen?
Right. So yeah, this is FCC, right? And you see, if you have in BCC, there are a lot of screw dislocation, and screw dislocation will do that, because screw dislocation, if you have a jog, that jog literally cannot move, other than you have to emit, okay? But this is an edge dislocation. So the Burgers vector is going horizontally, and then everybody is able to move horizontally. That's why it was very surprising for us. And there's no reason, I mean, if it just moves to the right, they don't have to emit vacancies, but it decides to climb along the dislocation and emit vacancies. So yeah, so that's why it's kind of not because usually we associate this kind of thing by jog on a screw dislocation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is from Gargaya. Would you like to jump in and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Rai. It was a very nice talk. So I was wondering, with respect to slide 21, what are the factors that could affect the transition, maybe like the initial dislocation density, and also if the transition is dependent on the deformation path?
Do you mean this page?
Yeah. So I see that there's a transition where the role of the temperature is being reversed.
Right. So I need to clarify. Okay. So yeah, sorry, I jump back and forth between different modeling techniques. So this is molecular dynamics simulation. Okay. So this is in the hierarchy of things. This is where we're here. And in fact, it's even a simpler simulation. It's a simulation in which I have only one dislocation and on a very nice plane, and then I'll just try to apply stress to move it. Okay. So it's a single dislocation, right? So the simulation cell is like this. We got a simulation cell with all atoms, and then we have one dislocation. Okay. Now, in terms of the transition, so this is basically each data point is one molecular dynamics simulation, right? It's for some disorientation configuration, it's like how long it is, how high is the jog, but then each one is like different, right? So different colors correspond to different temperatures, and then the horizontal axis is the stress, right? So this is basically saying that at low stress, you have one kind of temperature effect, and high stress, you have a different kind of temperature effect. It is consistent with what textbook says, but it's a little bit too consistent, okay? It's like, basically the jog obstructs your circular motion, right? So basically you can imagine you may have a critical stress to overcome that obstruction, but if you're below that stress, you can still move because thermal activation can help you overcome it. So in that case, you see that you are in a thermally activated regime, then the higher temperature, it helps you overcome, so the velocity is higher. But if you're already above the critical one, then basically you're already able to move even without temperature, and the temperature will only kind of produce more viscous drag. So those kind of two regimes for discrete motion, they are in the textbooks, but it's just like this is the first time I see it so clearly delineated. Okay, at the point at which that stress is like actually independent of temperature at the critical point. Yeah. But does that explain? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I understood it now better. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool.
Martin, you had a question about comparing with experiments?
Yes, yeah. Also from my side, nice talk. I was wondering a little bit when you compared to the experiments, I have the impression that the elastic regime is always a little bit off, and it seems to be consistently that the DDD underestimates the slope.
Right, right. That's a good observation. So the thingy, okay, yeah. So first of all, the elastic range, the purely elastic, oops, sorry. Okay, let me go back. The fully elastic range is not even a prediction, right? We have to input the elastic modulus. So that
Yeah.
okay, we have to put in. But the thing is that how come, like, did we put in the wrong elastic modulus, right? Because why would your point is why would the thing does not agree, right? Now that I think it's because I don't I think the answer is no, because I don't think because we can easily put in the correct Young's modulus, right? What happened is that I think in this range, what happened is that our dislocation in our DD simulation, because we have a very simple mobility law, also maybe because we didn't consider the jogs, right? So the dislocation will just start to move, okay? So this is actually not even the stress is very low. The dislocation will move, but not move in a big way. So it does not produce a lot of plastic strain. So I think that gives rise to this. Maybe it's another situation where, if you have jogs, I mean, then maybe they don't move, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we use a very simple linear mobility law. That basically says that, in fact, it will always move. So there's no yield stress to be,
Yeah.
defined in some sense.
Okay.
We have one more question in the chat, and we have 2 minutes, so this is perfect. So Junior, do you want to jump in?
Okay, yeah. Hi, Wei. Nice talk.
Hi.
So your presentation reminded me of a recent observation when we do lithium metal batteries, charge discharge. So we see that the lithium metal usually is very dense packed, but during charge discharge, there will be a lot of vacancy, and then it will grow very dramatically. I don't know if I'm totally new to this area, so I'm very just wondering if this can be related to the mechanism that you mentioned here, dislocation and
Right. Well, okay. So maybe applying some of this to the battery is a good direction to look into in the future. Now my gut feeling is that maybe it is not, because maybe the charging and discharging maybe has its own physics and somehow create vacancies, right? I mean, it's quite possible. What this is saying, but of course we cannot rule it out. But what this is saying is that if you have a metal and you plastically deform it, it creates vacancies. In fact, it is observed, and it sort of has always been a little bit puzzling. And in BCC metal, we know so that if you have screw dislocation, then it will do stuff and it will create vacancies. But what we have seen here is that even edge dislocation does that. Now, of course, we also did simulation for mixed dislocations. That basically this is a very ubiquitous behavior. So that may be saying that plastic deformation is certainly creating vacancies in a very general way. But I don't know whether in your case where there's so much severe plastic deformation that creates so much vacancies.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it's perfect timing. It brings us to the end of our hour. Let's thank Professor Tsai one more time.